Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. My name is Thaddeus Wicklow, and I've been keeping the Razorback Light for 11 years. It's a granite tower on the Maine coast, perched on a jagged reef that's claimed 37 vessels since they started counting in 1847. The light itself is a third-order Fresnel lens, rotating every 15 seconds, casting a beam that reaches 22 nautical miles on a clear night. My job is simple in theory: maintain the lens, monitor the radio, log vessel traffic through the Grand Manan Channel, and keep the fog signal operational when visibility drops below a quarter mile. In practice, the job means long stretches of solitude broken only by supply runs every 2 weeks and the occasional inspection from the Coast Guard. I live in the keeper's quarters beneath the tower, 3 rooms that smell perpetually of salt and diesel fuel, and I've grown accustomed to the rhythm of the place. The way the building shudders when the wind comes hard from the northeast, the way the lens mechanism clicks and hums through its rotation, the way the sea sounds different depending on the tide and the depth of the water over the reef. What happened last November started with a routine watch. I was in the lantern room at midnight, cleaning the lens panels with a chamois cloth and checking the lamp for carbon buildup. The weather was deteriorating, a low-pressure system moving in from the Atlantic, and I could see the cloud deck dropping toward the horizon, thick and dark. The barometer in my quarters had been falling steadily for 6 hours, and I'd already logged a warning in the station journal. Probable fog by 0400 hours, visibility expected to drop below operational minimums. The radio beside me was tuned to channel 16, the international distress frequency, and I was monitoring the chatter between a lobster boat heading back to port and the harbor master at Eastport. Normal traffic, routine check-ins, nothing that required my attention. I finished with the lens, verified the rotation mechanism was running smoothly, and descended the spiral staircase to the watch room where I kept the logbooks and the more sophisticated radio equipment. The watch room sits 1 level below the lantern, with windows facing in all directions, and from there I can see the full sweep of the channel and the approaches to the reef. At 0147 hours, the radio crackled with a distress call. It wasn't a formal mayday, not the structured protocol you're supposed to use, just a voice. Male, strained, transmitting on channel 16. The transmission was brief, maybe 10 seconds, and the audio quality was poor, heavy with static and what sounded like wind noise. I caught fragments. Taking water, position uncertain, Grand Manan approach. Then nothing, just the hiss of dead air. I waited 30 seconds and keyed my transmitter. Calling station in distress. This is Razorback Light. Please repeat your position and vessel identification. Over. No response. I tried again, adjusting the squelch, checking that my transmitter was functioning properly. Still nothing. I switched to the backup radio, scanned through the alternate channels in case the caller had moved frequencies. Silence. I logged the incident, noting the time, the fragmented content, and the lack of follow-up, and then I contacted the Coast Guard station at Southwest Harbor. The watch officer there was a man I'd worked with before, professional and efficient. I relayed what I'd heard, and he confirmed they had no record of a distress call at that time, no activation of an EPIRB beacon, no automated alerts from the AIS system. He said he'd check with Canadian authorities since the call mentioned Grand Manan, and he'd get back to me if anything developed. I stayed in the watch room, monitoring the radio, watching the sea. The fog was rolling in now, thick and fast, swallowing the channel in layers of gray. I activated the fog signal, a deep pneumatic blast that sounded every 30 seconds, and I increased the frequency of my visual sweeps, using binoculars to scan the water for any sign of a vessel in distress. The visibility dropped to less than 100 yards, and the world outside the windows became a featureless void, just the gray of the fog and the occasional flash of my own light reflected back at me. At 0230 hours, I thought I saw something. A dark shape moving parallel to the reef about 200 yards out. Too large to be a lobster boat. Too slow to be a pleasure craft running at speed. I watched it for maybe 30 seconds, trying to get a clear view, but the fog was too thick, and the shape dissolved back into the gray before I could identify it. I picked up the binoculars again and swept the area methodically. Grid pattern, left to right, but there was nothing. No running lights, no silhouette, no wake. I logged the sighting as unconfirmed and returned to the radio. The Coast Guard called back at 0310 hours. The watch officer said they'd checked with Canadian SAR and with the Vessel Traffic Service, and there were no reports of a distress call, no vessels overdue, no active search operations in the area. He asked if I was certain about what I'd heard, and I told him I was. He suggested it might have been a misfired transmission, someone testing equipment or transmitting accidentally on the wrong frequency. It happens, he said, more often than you'd think. I acknowledged and signed off, but the explanation didn't sit right. The voice on the radio had been urgent, stressed, not the tone of someone testing equipment, and the mention of taking water suggested an immediate problem, not a casual error. I stayed at my post, monitoring, waiting for a follow-up that never came. The fog persisted through the night, and by dawn it had thickened into a solid wall that reduced visibility to less than 50 feet. I couldn't see the water from the watch room, couldn't see anything except the gray press of the fog and the rhythmic sweep of my light cutting through it in 15-second intervals. The first anomaly appeared when I checked the AIS log that morning. The Automatic Identification System is a tracking network that monitors vessel traffic, displaying the position, course, speed, and identification details of any ship equipped with a transponder. Most commercial vessels are required to carry AIS, and many recreational boats use it voluntarily. The system logs every transmission, creating a digital record of who was where and when. I pulled up the log for the previous night, focusing on the time window around the distress call, and I found an entry that made me stop. At 0145 hours, 2 minutes before the radio transmission, an AIS signal had been recorded from a vessel identified as the Mary Celeste, MMSI number 338475621. Position approximately 3 nautical miles northeast of the Razorback Light. The entry showed the vessel moving southwest at 6 knots, course 225 degrees, heading directly toward the channel. I cross-referenced the MMSI number with the Coast Guard database, and the result came back negative. No vessel registered with that number. No record of a ship called Mary Celeste operating in North American waters. I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to make sense of it. The AIS system doesn't generate phantom entries. It's a transponder-based network, and every signal corresponds to a physical device on a physical vessel. If the log showed an entry, then a transponder had transmitted that data. But the MMSI number was unregistered. The vessel name wasn't in any database, and there was no follow-up signal after 0145 hours, as if the ship had simply vanished. I checked the log again, scrolling through the hours before and after, looking for any other transmissions from the same MMSI. Nothing, just that single entry, isolated and unexplained. I printed the log page and filed it with my incident report, and then I contacted the Coast Guard again. This time I spoke to a different officer, someone higher up the chain, and I explained what I'd found. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished he was silent for several seconds. Then he said he'd look into it, run the MMSI through additional databases, check with the Maritime Registry in Halifax. He told me to continue monitoring and to report any further anomalies immediately. The fog lifted that afternoon, and I took the opportunity to conduct a visual inspection of the reef and the surrounding waters. I launched the station's small inflatable boat and motored slowly along the edges of the reef, looking for debris, wreckage, any sign that a vessel had come to grief during the night. The water was calm, the swells long and lazy, and the visibility was good enough to see down into the kelp beds that clung to the rocks. I found nothing. No oil slicks, no floating debris, no disturbance in the kelp that would indicate a recent impact. I circled the reef twice, checking the channels between the larger rocks where a small boat might have lodged, and still there was nothing. I returned to the lighthouse and logged the inspection as complete with negative findings. That evening, the Coast Guard officer called back. He said they'd run the MMSI number through every database they had access to, including international registries and historical archives, and they'd found nothing. No vessel with that number had ever been registered. He said it was possible the transponder was malfunctioning, transmitting a corrupted or randomly generated number, or that it was a piece of test equipment someone had activated by mistake. I asked about the vessel name, Mary Celeste, and he said it was likely a coincidence, someone's idea of a joke. The original Mary Celeste was a famous ghost ship from the 1870s, found abandoned in the Atlantic with no crew aboard, and the name had been used by various vessels over the years, usually small boats with no official registration. He said not to worry about it, that if a vessel was actually in distress, they'd have received multiple calls, activated emergency beacons, left some trace. The fact that there was nothing suggested it was a false alarm, but I couldn't let it go. There was something wrong about the whole sequence, the distress call, the AIS entry, the complete absence of follow-up. I've been at sea long enough to know that coincidences happen, that equipment fails, that people make mistakes. But this felt different, more deliberate, as if someone had gone to considerable effort to create a presence and then erase it. I started pulling historical records, going through the Lighthouse logs for the past 20 years, looking for any similar incidents. The logs are meticulous, every watchkeeper required to document significant events, unusual sightings, distress calls, anything out of the ordinary. I found 3 entries that matched the pattern. The first was from 2003, a distress call on Channel 16 with fragmented audio and no follow-up, logged by the keeper at that time as unconfirmed. The second was from 2011, an AIS signal from an unregistered vessel that appeared briefly and then vanished. The third was from 2016, another distress call, this time mentioning engine failure and requesting assistance, followed by silence. In all 3 cases, the Coast Guard had investigated and found nothing. No wreckage, no missing vessels, no explanation. I compared the details looking for commonalities, and I found one that made my skin crawl. In every case, the incident occurred in November, always during a period of heavy fog, always in the small hours of the morning between midnight and 0400. I drafted a detailed report and sent it to the Coast Guard, along with copies of the historical log entries. I received an acknowledgement, but no substantive response, just a brief note saying they'd filed my report and would review it as resources allowed. That was 2 weeks ago, and I haven't heard anything since. Meanwhile, the station routine continues. I maintain the lens, monitor the radio, log vessel traffic. Morwenna Kersey, my assistant keeper, arrived yesterday for her rotation, and I briefed her on the incident. She's been in the service longer than I have, 23 years across 4 different lighthouses, and she's seen her share of strange occurrences. She listened carefully, asked a few questions, and then she said something that's been echoing in my head ever since. She said that in her experience, the sea doesn't keep secrets well. If something happens, if a vessel goes down or a crew gets into trouble, there's always evidence, always some trace that washes up eventually. The fact that there's nothing, she said, suggests that nothing happened, or that whatever happened wasn't meant to be found. I asked her what she meant by that, and she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between sympathy and wariness. She said there are operations that prefer not to be recorded. Vessels that move cargo or people without attracting attention. Ships that run dark, with transponders spoofing false identities or broadcasting intermittently to create confusion. She said if a vessel like that got into trouble, the last thing the operators would want is a Coast Guard investigation, port records, insurance claims. They'd rather sink quietly, leave no trace, let the incident fade into the background noise of false alarms and equipment malfunctions. I asked if she thought that's what the Mary Celeste was, some kind of smuggling operation, and she said she didn't know, but it would explain why there's no official record, no registered MMSI, no vessel matching that description in any database. It would explain why the distress call was so brief and why there was no follow-up. Because whoever was on that boat knew that calling for help meant exposing themselves to scrutiny they couldn't afford. The thought unsettles me more than the possibility of a genuine maritime disaster. A shipwreck is tragic, but it's part of the natural order, the risk that comes with working on the water. But a vessel deliberately erasing its own existence, operators who would rather drown than be identified, that suggests a level of calculation and desperation that feels alien to everything I know about this work. I keep thinking about the voice on the radio, the strain in those few words, the urgency. Someone was in trouble, real trouble, and they reached out for help. And then they disappeared, not just physically but from every record, every database, as if they'd never been there at all. I've been going over the AIS log obsessively, checking and rechecking the timestamp, the position, the course. The data is consistent, internally coherent, and it matches the timing of the distress call almost perfectly. But it leads nowhere, just a single point in a vast empty sea, a signal without a source. Last night I was back in the watchroom and I thought I heard something on the radio. Not a full transmission, just a brief burst of static with what might have been a voice underneath. I turned up the volume, adjusted the squelch, listened intently. It didn't repeat. I logged it as possible radio interference, atmospheric conditions, the usual suspects. But I can't shake the feeling that it was deliberate, another fragment from that same source, testing to see if anyone was listening. Morwenna came up to relieve me at 0200, and I mentioned it to her. She said the channel's been active tonight, lot of fishing traffic, probably just crosstalk. I nodded and headed down to my quarters, but I didn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the sound of the fog signal, that deep repetitive blast every 30 seconds, and I thought about all the vessels that have passed this light over the years, all the ships that ran dark or under false colors, all the cargoes that moved through these waters without official record. The history of this coast is full of smuggling. Rum runners during Prohibition, cigarette boats in the 80s, now probably drugs or people or whatever commodity is profitable enough to justify the risk. This morning, I walked down to the shore and stood on the rocks at low tide, looking out at the channel. The water was calm, almost glassy, and I could see the shapes of the reef beneath the surface, dark, irregular masses rising up from the bottom. I thought about what Morwenna said, about the sea not keeping secrets, and I wondered if that's true. Maybe the sea keeps secrets perfectly, better than we do, swallowing evidence, scattering debris across miles of open water, letting the currents and the tides and the relentless motion erase whatever happened. And maybe that's what the operators of vessels like the Mary Celeste count on, that their disappearance will be so complete, so thorough, that no one will ever know for certain whether they existed at all. I picked up a piece of driftwood and threw it into the water, watched it float for a moment and then get caught by the current and pulled away. In an hour, it would be a quarter-mile from here. In a day, it could be anywhere. And in a week, it would be so waterlogged and abraded that you couldn't tell where it came from or how long it had been drifting. Eamon Blackridge, the harbor master at Eastport, called this afternoon. He said he'd heard about my report through the Coast Guard, and he wanted to share something. He said that back in the 90s there was a similar incident. A vessel that appeared on radar near the Grand Manan Channel during a storm, broadcasting a distress signal, and then vanished before the Coast Guard could reach it. They searched for 3 days and found nothing. No wreckage, no survivors, no debris field. The incident was filed as an equipment malfunction, a ghost echo on the radar, but Blackridge said he never believed that. He said he knew boats that worked those waters, legitimate boats, and they all had stories about seeing vessels running without lights, appearing and disappearing, operating in the gaps between the official shipping lanes. He said the channel is perfect for that kind of operation. Lots of traffic to blend into, deep water close to shore, multiple routes in and out, and if you know the currents and the reefs, you can move almost invisibly. I asked him if he thought the Mary Celeste was real, and he said he thought something was out there that night, whether it was called the Mary Celeste or something else, whether it sank or made it to safety. He said the fact that the AIS signal was unregistered told him everything he needed to know. I thanked him and ended the call, and I sat in the watchroom for a long time, staring at the radio, at the AIS monitor, at the maps on the wall showing the channel and the reef and the approaches. I've been a lighthouse keeper for 11 years, and I've always understood my role to be straightforward. Maintain the light, warn vessels away from the rocks, provide a reference point for navigation. But now I'm wondering if there's another layer to this work, a shadow traffic that moves through these waters relying on the very isolation and discretion that defines this job. Lighthouses are watchers, but they're also lonely, cut off from the networks of enforcement and regulation that govern the ports and the harbors. Out here, on a reef in the middle of the channel, I can see everything and nothing, witness events that leave no record, hear voices that don't want to be heard. It's been 4 weeks since that night in November, and there's been nothing more, no further distress calls, no anomalous AIS signals, no contact from the Coast Guard beyond a brief acknowledgement of my follow-up report. The incident has been absorbed into the routine. Just another unexplained event in a long history of unexplained events. Morwenna rotates out tomorrow, and I'll be alone again for the next 2 weeks. She said to me this morning, just before she started packing her gear, that the important thing is to remember we're here for the vessels that need us, the legitimate traffic, the fishing boats and the ferries and the cargo ships that depend on this light to navigate safely. She said what happens in the margins, in the dark spaces between the official channels, that's not our concern, not our responsibility. I nodded, but I'm not sure I agree. If someone calls for help, even if they're operating outside the law, even if they're trying to erase their own existence, don't I have an obligation to respond? Or does the fact that they're invisible, unregistered, deliberately hidden, somehow release me from that duty? I don't have an answer, and I don't think I'm going to find one. What I have instead is a growing sense that the sea I watch from this tower is more complicated than I'd imagined, that the traffic moving through the Grand Manan Channel includes vessels I'll never see on any manifest, carrying cargo I'll never read about in any report. The Mary Celeste is one of them, a ghost in the database, a voice on the radio that came and went in the space of a few hours and left behind only questions. I keep the logbook entry, the printed AIS record, the notes from my conversations with the Coast Guard and with Blackridge, filed together in a folder that I've labeled simply November 2023. Sometimes I take it out and read through it, looking for something I missed, some detail that would make the pieces fit together into a coherent narrative. But there's nothing, just fragments, disconnected data points that suggest a presence without confirming it. Tonight, I'm back in the lantern room, cleaning the lens, checking the rotation mechanism, performing the same tasks I've performed 1,000 times before. The weather is clear, the visibility good, and I can see the lights of the fishing fleet working the waters to the north. Small, bright points moving slowly across the darkness. The radio is quiet, just the occasional check-in from a lobster boat or a Coast Guard patrol. Everything is normal, routine, exactly as it should be. But I find myself listening more carefully now, paying attention to the pauses between transmissions, the brief moments of static that might contain something more. And I watch the AIS monitor with a new awareness, scanning the list of vessels, checking their MMSI numbers against the database, looking for anomalies, for gaps, for signals that don't quite belong. Because I know now that the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, and that the sea I'm tasked with guarding holds more than I can see from this tower, more than any light can illuminate, more than any log can record. If the Mary Celeste is out there still, running dark, broadcasting false signals, moving through the margins, I'll probably never know. And if she went down that night, if the distress call was genuine and the crew is at the bottom of the channel, I'll never know that either. All I can do is keep the light burning, keep the radio on, keep logging the traffic that passes through my watch, and hope that if someone calls for help again, if another voice breaks through the static with that same urgent strain, I'll be ready to respond, even if it means confronting a truth that the official records would prefer to ignore, even if it means acknowledging that some vessels leave no trace. Some emergencies can't be answered, and some disappearances are meant to stay unexplained. The tower shudders slightly as a gust of wind comes off the water, and the lens rotates with its steady mechanical rhythm, casting its beam out into the darkness, sweeping across the channel, illuminating nothing and everything in 15-second intervals. A lighthouse keeper's eternal paradox, to see and not to see, to witness and to forget. My name is Obadiah Turn, and I've been keeping the Hatteras light for 9 years. The tower stands on the outer banks, 196 feet of brick and iron painted in distinctive black and white spirals, visible for 24 nautical miles in good conditions. The waters here are unforgiving, a maze of shifting sandbars and treacherous currents where the Gulf Stream meets the Virginia Drift, creating conditions that have earned this stretch of coast the name Graveyard of the Atlantic. More than 2,000 vessels have foundered in these waters since records began, and my job is to prevent that number from growing. I maintain the beacon, a first-order Fresnel lens that rotates every 7.5 seconds, and I coordinate with the Coast Guard station at Oregon Inlet to monitor vessel traffic through the Diamond Shoals, the shifting underwater ridges that extend 14 miles offshore and change configuration with every major storm. The work requires constant vigilance, attention to weather patterns, tide tables, and the subtle changes in the sandbar positions that can turn a safe passage into a death trap within hours. What happened last April began with a radio watch shift that Hester Vale and I were manning during a nor'easter. Hester is the station's radio operator, transferred here 2 years ago from a facility in the Chesapeake, and she knows the communication protocols better than anyone I've worked with. We were in the operations room, a climate-controlled space 2 levels below the lantern where we keep the radar equipment, the marine radio array, and the computer systems that link us to the Coast Guard's vessel traffic service. The storm had been building for 12 hours, winds gusting to 50 knots, seas running 15 to 20 feet, and we'd already issued multiple warnings to vessels transiting the area, advising them to seek shelter or stand well offshore until conditions improved. The radar screen showed a handful of contacts, mostly large commercial ships with the draft and power to handle the conditions, plus 2 fishing vessels that had wisely decided to ride out the storm in the lee of Cape Point. At 2130 hours, a new contact appeared on the radar, bearing 87 degrees, range 11 nautical miles, moving southwest at approximately 8 knots. Hester noted the contact in the log and tried to raise the vessel on Channel 16, the standard hailing frequency. No response. She switched to Channel 13, used for commercial traffic and bridge-to-bridge communication, and tried again. Still nothing. I moved to the radar console and examined the contact more closely. The return was strong and consistent, indicating a vessel of significant size, probably 60 feet or longer. But there was no corresponding AIS signal, no automatic identification broadcast that would tell us the vessel's name, flag, destination, or cargo. In these waters, especially during adverse weather, any vessel over a certain size is required to maintain an active AIS transponder, and the absence of that signal was the first irregularity. Hester tried several more times to establish radio contact, cycling through the common working channels, but the vessel remained silent. I checked the radar track, plotting the vessel's course and speed, and I didn't like what I saw. The vessel was heading directly toward the Diamond Shoals, following a bearing that would take it over the shallowest section of the bar, where the depth drops to less than 10 feet in places, far too shallow for anything but the smallest boats. I picked up the phone and called the Coast Guard station, speaking with Ronan Chilcott, the petty officer on duty that night. Ronan has been working these waters for 15 years, and he's seen just about every kind of maritime incident you can imagine. I described the situation, the unidentified radar contact, the lack of radio response, the dangerous course heading, and he said he'd dispatch a patrol boat to investigate. But with the storm conditions, it would take at least 40 minutes to reach the area. He asked me to continue monitoring and to try to establish contact, and if the vessel showed any signs of distress, to notify him immediately. I acknowledged and returned to the radar console. The contact was now 9 nautical miles out, still on the same heading, closing with the shoals at a steady pace. Hester had switched to the emergency frequency, broadcasting a general warning to all vessels in the area, advising them of hazardous conditions and requesting any vessel approaching Diamond Shoals from the east to alter course and respond. No one answered. At 2147 hours, something changed. A second radar contact appeared, bearing 92 degrees, range 14 nautical miles, moving on an almost identical southwest heading at the same speed. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. The 2 contacts were 3 miles apart, but they were moving in perfect synchronization, same course, same speed, as if they were part of a coordinated convoy. But there was no convoy traffic scheduled through this area, no advance notice of a formation transit, and the continued absence of AIS signals made the situation even more bizarre. Hester tried to raise both vessels, addressing them as a group, requesting any ship in the vicinity of Diamond Shoals to respond with identification and intentions. The radio remained silent, except for the hiss of atmospheric interference from the storm. I increased the radar's gain, trying to get more detail on the contacts, and that's when I noticed something peculiar. The 2 returns had identical characteristics: the same signal strength, the same profile, the same echo pattern, as if they were the same vessel appearing in 2 places simultaneously. I've seen radar anomalies before. Atmospheric ducting that causes signals to bounce and create false returns, sea clutter that mimics vessel contacts, interference from other equipment. But this didn't match any of those patterns. The contacts were too distinct, too stable, and they were maintaining consistent courses and speeds over multiple radar sweeps. I called Chilcott back and described the development. He was silent for a few seconds, then asked if I was certain about the radar calibration, whether there was any possibility of equipment malfunction. I ran a diagnostic on the spot, checking the magnetron, the waveguide, the display processor, everything tested normal, full functionality, no errors. He said the patrol boat was en route and should arrive at the first contact's position in approximately 25 minutes, and he'd keep the line open in case the situation developed further. I thanked him and turned back to the radar. The two contacts were now 7 and 10 miles out respectively, both still heading for the shoals, both still silent on the radio. Hester pulled up the marine traffic database on her computer, searching for any vessels that might match the profile we were seeing, any ships scheduled to transit the area, any reports of vessels operating without AIS. She found nothing, no scheduled traffic, no notices to mariners, no reported equipment failures that would explain the lack of identification signals. She expanded the search to include historical data, looking for similar incidents, unusual radar contacts, unexplained vessel sightings in this area. What she found made both of us go very still. There were 4 documented cases over the past 20 years, all occurring during storms, all involving unidentified radar contacts approaching Diamond Shoals, all ending with no wreckage found, no vessels reported missing, no explanation. The most recent was 3 years ago, almost to the day, and the description in the Coast Guard report matched what we were seeing now. Multiple contacts, no radio response, no AIS, apparent disregard for the hazardous conditions. I printed the report and read through it carefully. The investigating officer had concluded that the contacts were likely caused by atmospheric propagation, abnormal weather conditions creating false radar returns, and the lack of wreckage was attributed to the fact that no actual vessel had been present. But the language in the report was cautious, hedged, as if the officer wasn't entirely convinced by his own conclusion. There was a note at the end, a single sentence that stood out. Vessel traffic service records for the period in question show no correlation with observed radar data, suggesting either equipment malfunction or unregistered traffic operating without required safety systems. Unregistered traffic, vessels operating deliberately outside the monitoring systems, ships that didn't want to be identified or tracked. It aligned with the anomalies we were seeing, but it raised more questions than it answered. Why would a vessel run dark in conditions like this? Why approach one of the most dangerous sections of coast on the eastern seaboard without lights, without radio, without any of the safety equipment that might save them if they ran aground? At 22:03 hours, the first contact reached the outer edge of Diamond Shoals. The radar showed the vessel entering water less than 30 feet deep, moving at the same steady 8 knots, no deviation, no reduction in speed. I watched the screen intently, expecting to see the contact slow down, change course, show some sign that the operator was aware of the danger. Nothing changed. The vessel continued southwest, and within 3 minutes it had moved into water shallow enough that any normal ship would have grounded. But the radar return remained strong, consistent, showing no indication of distress, no change in motion. It was as if the vessel was passing over the shoals without touching them, sailing through water that should have torn the bottom out of any hull, and continuing on as if nothing had happened. Hester was on the radio, transmitting continuously now, urgency in her voice, warning the vessel that it was in extreme danger, that it needed to alter course immediately, that assistance was available if needed. No response. The second contact reached the shoals 4 minutes later, following the exact same track, maintaining the same speed, passing over the shallow water without incident. I grabbed the binoculars and went to the observation deck, a narrow catwalk that circles the lantern room. exposed to the weather but offering a 360-degree view of the surrounding sea. The wind hit me immediately, driving rain that stung like needles, and I had to brace myself against the railing to stay upright. I raised the binoculars and scanned the area where the radar showed the contacts, looking for running lights, for the silhouette of a hull, for any visual confirmation. The visibility was terrible, maybe a quarter mile in the rain and spray, but I should have been able to see something if a vessel that size was out there. I saw nothing, just the chaotic surface of the sea, white caps breaking in irregular patterns, the darkness beyond the reach of my light. I stayed on the deck for 10 minutes, sweeping the binoculars back and forth, checking different quadrants, different distances, but there was no vessel, no lights, nothing that corresponded to the radar contacts. I went back inside, soaked and shivering, and Hester handed me a towel. She'd been watching the radar while I was outside, and she said the contacts had continued southwest, now moving into deeper water on the far side of the shoals, still maintaining course and speed, still invisible to the eye. The Coast Guard patrol boat had reached the position where the first contact should have been, and Chilcott was on the phone asking what the hell was going on. I told him we had 2 contacts on radar, strong and consistent, but no visual confirmation and no radio response. He said the patrol boat was in the exact position the radar indicated, and there was nothing there, no vessel, no debris, no sign that anything had passed through. He said they were conducting a search pattern, expanding the radius, but the conditions were brutal, and visibility was near zero. I told him to stay on station, that the contacts were still moving on the radar and we needed to determine if they were real or some kind of equipment malfunction. Hester ran another diagnostic on the radar system, this time bringing in the backup unit and comparing the displays. Both radars showed the same contacts, same position, same heading, confirming that it wasn't a malfunction in a single unit. She checked the radar logs, the digital record of every return the system had captured over the past 24 hours, and the contacts were there, time-stamped, geolocated, tracked continuously from their first appearance. The data was clean, consistent, and entirely impossible to reconcile with the physical reality that the Coast Guard patrol boat was reporting. I've been doing this work long enough to know that radar isn't perfect, that there are conditions under which it can be fooled or confused, but I've never seen a case where 2 independent systems showed the same false returns with this level of detail and persistence. Something was generating those returns, something with mass and surface area sufficient to reflect a radar signal. But whatever it wasn't visible, and it wasn't where the radar said it should be. At 22:34 hours, both contacts vanished from the radar simultaneously, not gradually fading as they moved beyond range, but disappearing in an instant between one sweep and the next. Hester and I stared at the screen, waiting for them to reappear, but they didn't. The radar showed empty sea, no contacts, no anomalies, as if the vessels had never been there. Chilcott called asking if we still had them, and I said negative. We'd lost contact. Both targets gone at the same time. He said the patrol boat would continue searching for another hour, but with the weather deteriorating further and no clear indication of what they were looking for, he couldn't justify keeping them out longer. I agreed, thanked him for the response, and told him I'd file a detailed report in the morning. After I hung up, Hester and I sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind, the rain hammering against the windows, the steady hum of the equipment around us. She was the first to speak, asking if I believed the contacts were real, if I thought there were actual vessels out there. I said I didn't know, that the radar data suggested they were real, but the lack of visual confirmation and the Coast Guard's findings suggested otherwise. She nodded slowly, then said something that's been eating at me ever since. She said that when she was working in the Chesapeake, she'd heard stories from some of the older operators, men who'd been in the service for 30 or 40 years, about vessels that moved through the channels without identification, without lights, without any official presence. They called them shadow ships, boats that existed in the gaps of the monitoring systems, exploiting the limitations of radar and AIS to conduct operations that couldn't withstand scrutiny. She said most of the operators dismissed the stories as folklore, but a few of them claimed to have seen the shadow ships themselves, tracked them on radar, tried to make contact, and been ignored or threatened. She said the common thread in all the stories was that the shadow ships never appeared in official records, never filed transit plans, never showed up in port logs, as if they developed a methodology for moving cargo or people while leaving no documentary trace. I asked her if she thought that's what we'd seen tonight, and she said it was the only explanation that made sense, that a legitimate vessel wouldn't run dark in these conditions, wouldn't ignore radio calls, wouldn't approach hazardous shoals without taking precautions. But a vessel engaged in smuggling, in transporting contraband, in evading law enforcement, that vessel might take extreme risks if the alternative was being identified and interdicted. I thought about the patrol boat finding nothing at the indicated position, the simultaneous disappearance of both contacts, and I wondered if whoever was operating those vessels had been monitoring our radio transmissions, listening to the Coast Guard coordination, and had decided to kill their radar reflectors, drop below the detection threshold, and vanish before the patrol could reach them. It would require sophisticated equipment, real-time intelligence, and a level of operational discipline that seemed almost military, but it wasn't impossible. I started going through the Lighthouse logs the next morning, pulling records from the past 20 years, looking for any mention of unidentified contacts, unusual radar returns, unexplained incidents in the vicinity of Diamond Shoals. What I found was disturbing in its consistency. Every 2 to 3 years during storm conditions, there were reports of radar contacts that couldn't be confirmed visually, that didn't respond to radio hails, that disappeared without explanation. In most cases, the incidents were attributed to equipment issues or atmospheric anomalies, and no follow-up investigation was conducted. But taken together, the pattern suggested something more systematic, a recurring presence that exploited bad weather and limited visibility to move through the area undetected. I compiled a chronological list, noted the dates, the weather conditions, the radar characteristics, and I sent it to the Coast Guard station with a cover memo requesting a comprehensive review. Ronan Chilcott called me 2 days later. He said he'd forwarded my report to the district office, but he wanted to give me some unofficial context. He said there had been discussions within the Coast Guard about the possibility of organized smuggling operations using the Outer Banks as a transit route, taking advantage of the complex bathymetry, the frequent storms, the limited patrol resources. He said the challenge was that without concrete evidence, without intercepting an actual vessel or finding contraband, it was difficult to justify the resources needed for a sustained interdiction effort. He said my report would be added to the case file, but I shouldn't expect immediate action, that these things moved slowly through bureaucratic channels and often resulted in nothing more than enhanced monitoring. I asked him what he personally thought, whether he believed the contacts were real, and he was quiet for a moment before answering. He said that in his 15 years on these waters, he'd seen things that didn't fit into neat categories, events that challenged the official explanations, and he'd learned to trust his instincts even when the evidence was ambiguous. He said the radar data from that night was too consistent, too detailed, to dismiss as atmospheric interference, and the historical pattern I documented suggested a level of organization that was concerning. I've been thinking about those contacts constantly, running through the scenario again and again, trying to find an alternative explanation that doesn't involve criminal activity, that doesn't suggest a shadow fleet operating with impunity in waters I'm supposed to help protect. But every angle I examine leads back to the same conclusion. Someone is using these shoals as a corridor, timing their transits to coincide with weather events that reduce the effectiveness of monitoring systems, and they've been doing it for years without detection. The fact that they can apparently navigate the shoals safely, passing through water that would destroy most vessels, suggests local knowledge, detailed charts, possibly even real-time depth measurements taken during previous runs. It's sophisticated, deliberate, and unsettling in its implications. Hester and I have changed our watch protocols since that night. We run the radar continuously now, recording all contacts regardless of their apparent normalcy, flagging anything that lacks an AIS signal or doesn't respond to radio hails. We've also started cross-referencing our logs with the Coast Guard's incident reports, looking for correlations, patterns, any indication that might help identify when the next transit will occur. It's tedious work, hours spent reviewing data, comparing timestamps, mapping positions, but if there's a pattern we can predict, if we can anticipate when these vessels will appear, then maybe we can position resources to intercept them. So far, we haven't found anything definitive, but we're building a database, accumulating information that might eventually reach a threshold where action becomes unavoidable. Last week, I received a package in the mail, no return address, postmarked from a town I'd never heard of in South Carolina. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed text, no signature. The message was brief. The shoals remember what the records forget. Count the dark transits and you'll find the pattern, but knowing the pattern won't change what happens next. Some cargo moves in the spaces between official notice, and those who carry it prefer the silence of a storm to the scrutiny of clear weather. The Lighthouse sees, but the Lighthouse doesn't report what it's not supposed to see. Keep your logs private, Keeper, or you'll find yourself transferred to a tower where the only traffic is legitimate, and the only questions are the ones with approved answers. I showed the letter to Hester, and her face went pale. She said this was exactly the kind of thing that happened in the Chesapeake. Operators who asked too many questions or documented too much detail suddenly finding themselves reassigned. Their reports filed away, their concerns dismissed as paranoia or overreach. I don't know who sent the letter, or how they knew about my report to the Coast Guard, but the message was clear. Someone is watching, someone with enough access to know what I'm doing, and enough influence to suggest consequences if I continue. The rational part of me says I should ignore it, that anonymous threats are typically empty bluster, that I have a duty to report what I observe, regardless of external pressure. But another part, the part that's spent 9 years on this isolated tower learning to trust my instincts, that part is telling me to be careful, that the waters around Diamond Shoals have claimed vessels for centuries, and I don't want to become another unexplained disappearance in the archives. I've continued logging the radar contacts, continued documenting anomalies, but I've stopped sending reports to the district office, stopped pushing for investigation or follow-up. I keep my own records now, detailed notes in a journal that I store in a locked drawer in my quarters, and I wait. It's been 3 months since that April night, and there haven't been any further incidents, no unidentified contacts, no mysterious disappearances from the radar screen. The summer weather has been mostly calm, clear skies and light winds, conditions that don't favor the kind of covert operations I suspect are happening during storms. But hurricane season is approaching, and with it, the likelihood of more nor'easters, more periods of reduced visibility, and limited patrol coverage. I've been monitoring the weather forecasts obsessively, watching for the formation of storms that might provide cover for another dark transit, and I've positioned myself to be on watch during those windows. Hester has noticed my increased attention to the forecast models, and she asked me yesterday if I was planning to do something when the next storm came. I said I didn't know, that I was still trying to decide whether intervention was possible or wise. She said she'd support whatever decision I made, but she wanted me to remember that we're lighthouse keepers, not law enforcement. And our primary responsibility is to the vessels that request our assistance, not to the ones that actively avoid it. She's right, of course, but it doesn't make the situation easier. I keep thinking about the distress call that never came, about the possibility that one of these shadow vessels will miscalculate, will run aground on the shoals, will sink with all hands because they were too committed to secrecy to call for help. And I wonder what my obligation is in that scenario, whether I should feel guilty for not doing more to prevent it, or whether the operators of these vessels have forfeited any claim to protection by choosing to operate outside the boundaries of law and safety. It's a philosophical question without a clear answer, and it's one I suspect I'll be wrestling with for as long as I keep this light. The tower stands, the lens rotates, the radio maintains its eternal listen, and I continue the work that brought me here, warning vessels away from danger, providing a fixed point of reference in a dynamic and treacherous seascape. But I'm aware now, in a way I wasn't before, that not all the vessels passing through these waters want to be seen, that some of them carry cargo that can't be declared, and that the absence of documentation is not always accidental. The official records will show clear nights and routine patrols, accurate navigation and safe passage, but the unofficial truth, the one I'm documenting in my private journal, tells a different story. It's a story about vessels that exist in the margins, about operators who've learned to exploit the limitations of monitoring systems, about a maritime underworld that moves with the precision of legitimate traffic but leaves no trace in the archives. And it's a story that I'm part of now, whether I want to be or not, because I've seen what the records deny. I've tracked what the databases can't confirm, and I know that somewhere in the darkness beyond my light, there are ships that will never appear on any manifest, captains who will never file a float plan, and cargo that will never pass through customs. The graveyard of the Atlantic earned its name from the vessels that foundered on these shoals, but maybe it should also remember the ones that passed through safely, the ones that navigated the deadly shallows with impossible accuracy, the ones that came and went without leaving any evidence except a few radar returns that no one believed, and a lighthouse keeper's growing conviction that the sea holds more secrets than any chart can show. My name is Llewellyn March, and I've been keeping the Split Rock Light on Lake Superior for 13 years. The lighthouse stands on a cliff face 200 feet above the water, accessible only by a steep wooden stairway that descends from the highway. It's one of the most isolated stations on the Great Lakes, built in 1910 after a November storm destroyed 29 vessels in a single night, and its primary function is to mark the dangerous reef system that extends northeast from the cliff for nearly 3 miles. The light itself is a third-order bioptic lens, flashing every 10 seconds with a characteristic pattern that mariners can identify even in conditions of limited visibility. The waters of Superior are cold year-round, averaging 40 degrees in summer and just above freezing in winter, and the lake has claimed more vessels per mile of coastline than any other body of freshwater in the world. My job is to maintain the light, monitor weather conditions, coordinate with the Coast Guard station at Duluth, and maintain the station's archival records, a collection of logbooks, incident reports, and wreck documentation that dates back to the lighthouse's inception. What happened last October started with a routine inspection of the archives. Isolde Penhale, my relief keeper, had arrived for her quarterly rotation, and we were conducting the standard inventory of documents required by the National Park Service, which administers the station as a historic site. The archive room is located in the original keeper's quarters, a small stone building adjacent to the tower, with climate-controlled storage and a cataloging system that I'd spent years organizing. We keep logbooks from every keeper who served at the station, detailed records of weather conditions, vessel traffic logs, and most significantly, a comprehensive collection of wreck reports from ships that foundered in the vicinity. It's one of the most complete maritime disaster archives on the Great Lakes, used regularly by researchers, historians, and occasionally by insurance companies investigating century-old claims. Isolde and I were working our way through the inventory checklist when we discovered that an entire logbook was missing, specifically the log from November 1928, a month that included one of the worst storms in the lake's history. The absence was particularly troubling because the 1928 log was one of the most frequently referenced documents in the collection. It contained detailed observations of the storm that sank the freighter MV Kamloops, along with 17 other vessels, resulting in the loss of more than 200 lives. Researchers had examined that log dozens of times over the years, and I personally had consulted it just 6 months earlier when a graduate student was writing a thesis on Great Lakes storm patterns. I knew the log existed, knew its contents, knew exactly where it should be on the shelf, but it wasn't there. Isolde suggested it might have been misfiled, moved to a different section during a previous inventory, or loaned out to a researcher who hadn't returned it. We spent the next 4 hours conducting a comprehensive search, checking every shelf, every storage box, every drawer, looking for any sign of the missing logbook. We found nothing, no record of the document being relocated, no lending slip indicating it had been checked out, no gap in the chronological sequence that might suggest it had been deliberately removed. I called Cormac Threadgill, the wreck archivist at the Great Lakes Maritime Museum in Duluth, and asked if he had any record of the 1928 log being transferred to the museum's collection. Cormac has been documenting Great Lakes shipwrecks for 30 years, and he's intimately familiar with the Split Rock archives, having visited the station multiple times to photograph and catalog our holdings. He said he had no record of receiving the log, and in fact, he'd referenced our copy just last year, when he was preparing an exhibit on the Kamloops disaster. He asked if I'd checked the digitization backups, the scanned copies we'd made of the most important documents, and I told him I had, but the digital file for the 1928 log was corrupted, showing only static and unreadable text, as if the scanning process had failed or the file had been damaged. He was silent for a moment, then said something that made my skin crawl. He said that in his experience, when a document of that historical significance disappeared from a well-maintained archive, it wasn't usually an accident. I asked what he meant, and he said there were cases, rare but documented, where archival material was deliberately removed because it contained information that someone didn't want preserved. Details that contradicted official narratives or exposed liabilities that were supposed to have been resolved. He said the 1928 storm was one of the most controversial maritime disasters in Great Lakes history, because several of the vessels that sank had been operating with expired safety certificates, inadequate crew training, and cargo that violated weight restrictions. There had been investigations, lawsuits, criminal charges, and in some cases evidence had been suppressed or destroyed to protect corporate interests and limit financial liability. He said if the 1928 log contained observations that contradicted the official findings, observations that might reopen those cases or challenge the settled narrative, then there could be motivation to remove it from circulation. I thanked him for the insight and ended the call, but his words stayed with me. I couldn't imagine who would go through the effort of breaking into a locked archive room to steal a 90-year-old logbook, but I also couldn't explain the document's absence through normal means. Isolde and I spent the rest of the day reviewing the security logs, checking the access records for the archive room, looking for any indication that someone had entered without authorization. The room is locked with a keypad system, and every entry is time-stamped and recorded. We found nothing anomalous, no unauthorized entries, no unusual access patterns, no signs of forced entry or tampering with the lock mechanism. The last recorded access was my own entry 3 weeks earlier when I'd retrieved a document for a Park Service inspection, And before that, it was a researcher from the University of Minnesota who'd been granted permission to photograph some of the older logbooks. I contacted the researcher, described the missing log, and asked if she'd seen it during her visit. She said she remembered the log clearly, had photographed several pages, and in fact, she still had the photos on her laptop. She offered to send them to me, and within an hour, I had high-resolution images of about 30 pages from the 1928 log, dated entries covering the first 3 weeks of November. I printed the images and read through them carefully, looking for anything that might explain why the physical log would be targeted for removal. The entries were consistent with other logs from that era. Detailed weather observations, notes on vessel traffic, descriptions of wave heights and wind speeds during the storm. But one entry stood out, dated November 7th, 3 days before the main storm hit, describing an unusual sighting. The keeper at that time, a man named Wickham, had noted the passage of a freighter moving northeast along the coast, running without lights, traveling at high speed despite deteriorating conditions. He'd attempted to signal the vessel using the station's searchlight, but it hadn't responded, and he'd noted in the log that the ship appeared to be the Kamloops, based on its silhouette and configuration, though the Kamloops wasn't scheduled to pass Split Rock until November 10th, according to the published shipping schedules. Wickham had added a note at the bottom of the entry. Vessel observed does not match official transit plan. Radio silent. No response to signals. Recorded for documentation purposes pending clarification from shipping office. The entry was cryptic, but its implications were significant. If the Kamloops had been in the area 3 days before its scheduled arrival, that suggested either a deviation from its filed route or an error in the shipping records. And if the vessel was running dark, without lights or radio, that suggested it was deliberately avoiding detection, possibly because it was carrying undeclared cargo or conducting unauthorized operations. I compared the entry to the official inquiry report on the Kamloops sinking, the document published by the shipping authorities that established the timeline of events and the probable cause of the disaster. According to the official report, the Kamloops had departed Fort William on November 9th, following its approved route, and had encountered the storm approximately 30 hours later. There was no mention of an earlier sighting, no reference to the vessel being in the Split Rock area on November 7th, no acknowledgement of Wickham's observation. The official timeline and the logbook entry were fundamentally incompatible. I showed the printed pages to Isolde, and she read the entry several times before responding. She said that if the logbook was accurate, then the official inquiry had either missed a crucial piece of evidence or had deliberately excluded it from the findings. She said there could be legitimate reasons for the exclusion. Perhaps Wickham had misidentified the vessel. Perhaps the ship he saw was a different freighter that happened to resemble the Kamloops. But she also said that the deliberate removal of the logbook from the archive suggested someone wanted to ensure that Wickham's observation remained obscure, that it couldn't be used to challenge the established narrative. I asked her if she thought it was possible that the Kamloops had been engaged in smuggling, running illegal cargo in the days before its final voyage, and that the shipping company had suppressed evidence of that activity to avoid additional liability. She said it was possible that during the Prohibition era there was extensive smuggling across the Great Lakes, with freighters occasionally carrying bootleg liquor or contraband alongside legitimate cargo, and that companies had strong incentives to keep such operations hidden. I decided to expand the investigation, to check whether there were other documents in the archive that referenced the Kamloops or contained information that might have been suppressed. I spent the next week going through every logbook, every incident report, every piece of correspondence in the collection, looking for mentions of unusual vessel behavior, sightings that didn't match shipping schedules, observations that contradicted official records. What I found was a pattern, subtle but unmistakable. Over the past century, there were at least a dozen entries describing vessels that appeared in locations where they weren't supposed to be. Ships running without lights, freighters that didn't respond to signals, observations that were never included in subsequent investigations or official reports. In every case, the vessels mentioned in these entries had eventually been involved in accidents, sinkings, or insurance claims. And in every case, the official findings made no reference to the earlier anomalous sightings. I compiled the entries into a spreadsheet, noting the dates, the vessel names, the nature of the observations, and the outcomes. The pattern suggested a systematic discrepancy between what lighthouse keepers were observing and what was being recorded in official maritime records. It was as if there were two parallel realities: the documented reality of shipping manifests and inquiry reports, and the observed reality of actual vessel movements that included unexplained detours, illegal operations, and activities that companies preferred to keep off the books. I sent the spreadsheet to Cormac, asking if he'd seen similar patterns in other archives, and he responded within hours. He said he'd been aware of discrepancies for years, but had never had the evidence to document them systematically. He said my findings aligned with research being done by a historian at the Minnesota Historical Society who was examining the relationship between maritime insurance fraud and Great Lakes shipwrecks, investigating cases where vessels were deliberately sunk to collect insurance payouts or to destroy evidence of illegal cargo. Cormac said he wanted to come to Split Rock to examine the archive in person, to review the documents I'd found and to discuss the implications of the missing 1928 log. He arrived 3 days later, and we spent an entire afternoon going through the materials, cross-referencing entries, checking dates against shipping records and insurance claims. He was particularly interested in the entries describing vessels running without lights, and he asked if I had any theory about why ships would operate that way. I said the only explanation that made sense was that they were trying to avoid detection, either because they were carrying contraband or because they were engaged in activities that violated shipping regulations or insurance conditions. He nodded and said that was consistent with his research, that during certain periods, particularly Prohibition and the Depression, there had been extensive illegal activity on the Great Lakes, with vessels sometimes making undocumented stops, transferring cargo at sea, or operating under false manifests to evade customs inspections or tax obligations. He pulled out a folder from his briefcase and showed me a document. A letter from a maritime insurance investigator dated 1929, addressed to the shipping company that owned the Kamloops. The letter questioned the company's explanation for the vessel's loss, noting inconsistencies in the timeline, unexplained delays in the ship's departure from Port William, and reports from unnamed sources that the Kamloops had been observed in locations that didn't match its filed route. The letter concluded by requesting additional documentation, specifically logbook entries from coastal stations along the vessel's route, to verify the company's claims. Cormac said the letter had been part of a larger investigation into possible insurance fraud, but the investigation had been closed without resolution, and the requested documentation had apparently never been provided. He said he'd been trying for years to find those logbook entries, and now we knew why they were missing, because they'd been systematically removed from the archives to prevent them from being used in litigation or regulatory proceedings. I asked Cormac if he thought the insurance company or the shipping company was responsible for the removal, and he said he didn't know, that both had motivation to suppress evidence, as did potentially the investigators themselves if they'd been compromised or pressured to close the case. He said the problem with historical research into this kind of activity was that the people involved were long dead, the companies had been acquired or dissolved, and the paper trails had been deliberately obscured or destroyed. He said the best we could do was document what we'd found, publish the findings in academic journals, and hope that it contributed to a more accurate understanding of Great Lakes maritime history. But he also said I should be careful, that even though the events were nearly a century old, there were still interests that might prefer the official narrative to remain unchallenged, particularly if those narratives protected ongoing business relationships or institutional reputations. 2 days after Cormac left, I received a phone call from someone who identified himself as a representative of the historical foundation that provides funding for the Split Rock Archive program. He said he'd heard that I'd been conducting research into discrepancies in the archive's holdings, and he wanted to clarify the foundation's position on such activities. He said the foundation supported legitimate historical research, but it had concerns about investigations that might cast the archive in a negative light or suggest that its stewardship of historical materials had been inadequate. He said there were reputational considerations, donor relationships that needed to be protected, and a preference for focusing on the archive's strengths rather than on missing or problematic documents. He suggested that I might want to reconsider the direction of my research, perhaps focus on other aspects of the collection that would generate positive attention rather than controversy. The call was polite, professional, and deeply unsettling in its implications. I told him I appreciated his concerns, but that my responsibility as a keeper extended to maintaining the integrity of the archive, which included documenting discrepancies and investigating gaps in the collection. He was silent for a moment, then said he understood my position, but hoped I would consider the broader context, the potential impact on funding, on partnerships with other institutions, on the station's ability to continue operating as a research facility. He said difficult decisions sometimes had to be made about what to preserve and what to let go, and that dwelling on historical controversies that couldn't be definitively resolved might not serve the archive's best interests. I thanked him for calling and ended the conversation, but the message was clear. There were limits to how much scrutiny the archive's gaps could withstand, and exceeding those limits could have consequences for the station's operation and my continued employment. Isolde and I discussed the call that evening, and she asked if I was planning to continue the research despite the warning. I said I felt obligated to document what I'd found, that the discrepancies were significant and deserved to be part of the historical record. But I also recognized that there were political and financial dimensions to the work that went beyond pure scholarship. She said she'd support whatever decision I made, but she wanted me to understand that institutions had long memories, that challenging official narratives could have career implications, and that I needed to weigh the value of exposing old secrets against the cost of doing so. I said I understood, and I spent the next several days thinking about what to do, weighing my responsibility to historical accuracy against the practical realities of institutional politics and funding dependencies. In the end, I decided to document everything I'd found, but to frame it carefully, to present the findings as preliminary observations that required further investigation, rather than as definitive conclusions that challenged established historical narratives. I wrote a detailed report describing the missing 1928 log, the discrepancies between keeper observations and official records, and the pattern of vessels appearing in unexpected locations. I sent the report to Cormac and to the historian at the Minnesota Historical Society, and I filed a copy in the archive's administrative records where it would be available to future researchers. But I didn't publish it publicly, didn't submit it to academic journals, didn't push for media coverage or institutional recognition. I kept my findings within the professional community, shared them with people who would understand their significance and who might be able to build on them, but I avoided the kind of public disclosure that might have triggered backlash or retaliation. It's been 6 months since then, and the missing 1928 log has not reappeared. I've continued to maintain the archive, continued to assist researchers, continued to perform the daily tasks of lighthouse keeping. But I'm aware now, in a way I wasn't before, that the collection I manage is incomplete, that there are gaps that can't be explained by accident or neglect, and that some of those gaps were created deliberately to protect interests that valued secrecy over historical accuracy. I think about Wickham, the keeper who made that observation in 1928, who documented something he saw even though it contradicted official schedules, who added that note about pending clarification from the shipping office. I wonder if he ever received that clarification, or if his observation was dismissed, filed away, eventually removed from the record entirely because it was inconvenient, because it suggested questions that no one wanted to answer. The lake continues its eternal cycle, freezing in winter, thawing in spring, claiming vessels in storms that come with increasing frequency as the climate shifts. I keep the light burning, maintain the lens, monitor the weather, and fulfill my duties as I've always done. But I also keep my own private archive now, a collection of notes and observations that exist outside the official record, documenting the things I've learned about the gap between what gets recorded and what actually happens. I record vessel movements that seem unusual, note sightings that don't match published schedules, document anomalies that might, decades from now, help someone else understand that the maritime history preserved in official archives is only part of the story, that the complete picture includes the vessels that moved in darkness, the cargo that was never declared, and the observations that were systematically excluded because they complicated narratives that powerful interests wanted to keep simple. Last week, a researcher came to the archive looking for information about a vessel that sank in 1934. She had a specific question about the ship's route, whether it had passed Split Rock on the night before it foundered. I pulled the relevant logbook and found the entry she needed, but as I was copying the page for her, I noticed another entry on the same page, describing an unidentified freighter running without lights, moving at high speed through dangerous waters. The entry was brief, just a few lines, but it was dated the same night as the vessel she was researching, and the description matched the ship's profile. I showed her the entry, and she read it several times, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. She asked if there were other entries like this, and I said yes, scattered throughout the collection. She said she'd been researching maritime insurance fraud for her dissertation, and this was exactly the kind of evidence she needed. Contemporary observations that suggested vessels were deviating from their official routes in the hours before they sank. She asked if she could photograph all the relevant entries, and I agreed. But as we worked through the logbooks, I found myself watching the door, half expecting someone to arrive and shut down the research, to invoke institutional concerns or reputational risks. No one came, and after 3 hours she had photographs of more than 50 entries describing unusual vessel behavior, observations that had been recorded by keepers over the decades but had never been incorporated into official histories. She thanked me profusely, said this would transform her dissertation, make it possible to document patterns that had previously been only suspected. I wished her well, and after she left I locked the archive and returned to the tower. I stood in the lantern room for a long time, watching the light rotate, watching the beam sweep across the dark water, and I thought about all the vessels that had passed below this cliff over the past century, some of them following their filed routes, some of them deviating for reasons that were never officially acknowledged, some of them carrying secrets that went down with them when they sank. The archive continues to grow, new documents added, old ones deteriorating despite our best preservation efforts, and I continue to maintain it as best I can, knowing that it's incomplete, knowing that the gaps matter as much as what's preserved. I've accepted that I'll probably never know who removed the 1928 log or why, never know whether it was destroyed or simply hidden away in some private collection, never know whether Wickham's observation about the Kamloops was accurate or mistaken. But I've documented what I can, preserved the evidence that remains, and created a record that future researchers can build on. A record that acknowledges the possibility that our official maritime history is less complete than we've been told, that there are vessels missing from the archives just as surely as there are vessels missing from the lake bottom, and that sometimes the most important information is precisely what's been left out. The light continues to flash its warning, 10 seconds on, 10 seconds off, marking the reef, guiding vessels away from danger, performing the function it was built to perform. And I continue my work, keeper of both the light and the archive, guardian of what's been preserved and witness to what's been lost, standing watch over a coast that has seen more than any record can show, remembering more than any document can tell. My name is Bramwell Cutter, and I've been keeping the Farallon light for 14 years. The lighthouse stands on southeast Farallon Island, 27 miles west of San Francisco, one of the most remote and inhospitable stations on the Pacific coast. The islands are a cluster of rocky outcrops surrounded by some of the most dangerous waters in California, with currents that can exceed 6 knots, fog that persists for weeks at a stretch, and shark populations dense enough to make these islands known locally as the Red Triangle. The light itself is a first-order Fresnel lens housed in a reinforced concrete tower, flashing every 5 seconds with an intensity visible for 26 nautical miles in clear conditions, though clear conditions are rare here. My primary responsibilities include maintaining the automated beacon system, monitoring maritime traffic through the shipping lanes that converge west of the Golden Gate, coordinating with the Coast Guard station at Point Bonita, and documenting the substantial wildlife populations that make these islands significant for biological research. The station is staffed year-round despite automation, because the environment requires constant maintenance, equipment monitoring, and emergency response capability that can't be adequately provided remotely. What happened last February began with a routine inspection of the station's historical records, specifically the collection of shipping logs and incident reports maintained since the lighthouse became operational in 1855. Elowyn Hartwell, a marine surveyor contracted by the California Maritime Authority, had requested access to the archives as part of a comprehensive study of Pacific coast navigation hazards and vessel traffic patterns. Elowyn specializes in historical maritime data, reconstructing shipping routes, and analyzing incident patterns to identify systemic risks, and she'd been working her way up the coast examining lighthouse records at every major station. She arrived on the supply helicopter looking tired and windburned from weeks spent at isolated outposts, and after the standard safety briefing I took her to the archive room, a climate-controlled space in the original keeper's quarters where we maintain logbooks, correspondence, and reports dating back to the station's inception. I left her there with instructions on how to operate the document scanner and told her I'd check back in a few hours. When I returned at noon, she was standing at the archive table holding a folder, her expression somewhere between confusion and concern. She asked me about the station's protocol for recording vessel casualties, whether there were specific requirements for documenting ships that foundered within visual range of the lighthouse. I said there were, that any observed maritime incident was supposed to be logged immediately with details including vessel identification, time, location, observed conditions, and any rescue efforts undertaken. She nodded slowly, then showed me what she'd found. It was an incident report dated March 14, 1962, describing the sinking of a container ship called the Serpent's Cross, approximately 8 nautical miles northwest of the Farallones during a severe storm. The report was detailed, noting that the keeper on duty had observed the vessel taking on water, listing heavily to starboard, and eventually capsizing within 40 minutes of the initial sighting. The keeper had immediately notified the Coast Guard, but by the time rescue vessels arrived, the ship had gone down with no survivors recovered, and the report concluded with a note that wreckage had been spotted over the following days, but no bodies were found. Elowyn said the report was thorough and consistent with standard documentation practices, but when she tried to cross-reference it with Coast Guard records, maritime casualty databases, and shipping company archives, she'd found nothing. No vessel named Serpent's Cross appeared in any official registry. No container ship was reported missing in March 1962. no insurance claim was filed for a vessel lost in the Farallon area during that period. She'd expanded her search to include international databases, checking Lloyd's Register, the International Maritime Organization Casualty Database, historical shipping manifests from San Francisco port records, and every source she could access. The vessel didn't exist in any official capacity, had no registration number, no port of origin, no documented cargo or crew manifest. She said it was as if someone had written a detailed incident report for a ship that was never built, a sinking that never happened, except that the report was filed in the official Lighthouse logs with all the appropriate signatures and timestamps. I took the folder and read through the report carefully. The handwriting was consistent with other entries from that period. The format matched standard Coast Guard documentation requirements, and the signature at the bottom belonged to William Graves, the keeper on duty in 1962. I'd seen Graves's handwriting in dozens of other log entries, knew his documentation style, and this report appeared authentic in every detail. I checked the date stamp, the reference numbers, the official seals applied by the Coast Guard inspector who'd reviewed the file during a subsequent station audit. Everything looked legitimate, procedurally correct. Exactly what you'd expect from a properly documented maritime casualty. But if Elowin was right, if no vessel matching this description existed in any official record, then the report documented something that couldn't have happened, or documented something that was deliberately kept out of the official maritime archives. I told Elowin I'd need to verify her findings, that perhaps the vessel had been registered under a different name or flag, that records from the early 60s were sometimes incomplete or misfiled. She said she'd considered those possibilities and had searched using every variation she could think of. Alternative spellings, similar vessel names, ships with comparable tonnage and configuration that went missing around the same time. She'd found nothing that matched. She said the completeness of the void was what troubled her most, that if this were simply a clerical error or a misfiled record, there would be some trace, some fragment of documentation. But there was nothing, as if the Serpent's Cross had been systematically erased from every database, every archive, every official record except this single incident report filed at a remote lighthouse station that most researchers would never think to check. I contacted Silas Quine, the port investigator at the San Francisco Maritime Authority, and described what we'd found. Silas has been investigating maritime incidents for 23 years and has access to records and databases that aren't available to the public or even to most researchers. I sent him scanned copies of the incident report and asked if he could run a comprehensive search through his systems. He called back 3 hours later, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. He said he'd checked everything, run the vessel name through federal databases, state records, historical shipping manifests, customs declarations, everything he could access. No results, no vessel named Serpent's Cross, no container ship lost in California waters in March 1962. He said he'd even checked classified Coast Guard databases, records that included vessels engaged in sensitive operations or military support activities that might not appear in public archives. Still nothing. He asked if I thought the report might be fabricated, some kind of training exercise or documentation drill that got filed with the real incident reports by mistake. I said it was possible but unlikely that the level of detail in the report, the integration with other log entries from that period, the official seals and signatures, all suggested this was treated as a genuine incident at the time. Silas said he'd continue investigating, would reach out to retired Coast Guard personnel who might remember incidents from that era, would check with maritime historians and shipwreck researchers who specialized in Pacific Coast casualties. He said if the vessel existed, if it had actually sunk, someone somewhere would have a record of it, would remember the rescue efforts, would have documentation that could corroborate the Lighthouse report. But he also said, in a tone that suggested he'd seen similar situations before, that there were vessels during certain periods that operated outside normal documentation protocols, ships engaged in sensitive cargo transport or classified government operations that might not appear in standard maritime records. He said if the Serpent's Cross was one of those vessels, then the absence of documentation wouldn't be accidental. It would be deliberate. Part of operational security measures designed to obscure the vessel's existence and activities. That conversation opened a line of inquiry I hadn't considered. The possibility that the Serpent's Cross was involved in covert operations, transporting cargo or personnel that couldn't be officially acknowledged, operating under a false identity, or as part of a classified program. The early 60s were a period of intense Cold War activity, with significant military operations along the Pacific coast, nuclear submarine movements, surveillance activities, and cargo shipments that were deliberately kept off the books for security reasons. I started reviewing other log entries from 1962, looking for any mention of unusual vessel traffic, military activities, or incidents that might provide context for the Serpent's Cross sinking. I found several entries describing Navy vessels operating near the Farallones, submarine exercises, and periods when civilian vessels were advised to avoid certain areas due to classified operations. But there was nothing that directly connected to the container ship or explained why it would have been operating without official documentation. Elowin spent the next 2 days going through every log entry, every piece of correspondence, every document in the archive that dated from 1960 through 1965, looking for additional references to the Serpent's Cross or to vessels operating under similar circumstances. She found 3 more entries that stood out, not directly related to the container ship, but describing other vessels that appeared in the Lighthouse logs but couldn't be verified in official records. The first was a fishing trawler reported overdue in 1961. The second was a cargo vessel that requested emergency assistance in 1963, but then departed before help arrived. And the third was a yacht that was observed conducting what the keeper described as unusual nighttime operations in 1964. In each case, Elowin had tried to verify the vessel's existence through standard databases and had found nothing, no registration, no ownership records, no confirmation that the ships existed outside the Lighthouse logs. The pattern was disturbing in its consistency, suggesting that over a 5-year period in the early 60s, multiple vessels had passed through the Farallon area that existed in the observations of lighthouse keepers but nowhere in official maritime documentation. I asked Elowin if she'd found similar patterns at other stations along the coast, and she said yes, that at Point Reyes and Año Nuevo she'd discovered comparable anomalies, vessels documented in lighthouse logs that couldn't be verified through standard channels. She said she was beginning to suspect that there had been a systematic program during that era, a coordinated effort involving multiple agencies to conduct maritime operations that left minimal documentary trace, using false identities, unregistered vessels, and routes that avoided the standard monitoring systems. She said if that was true, then the Lighthouse logs represented one of the few remaining sources of information about those operations, because keepers documented what they observed regardless of whether the vessels wanted to be documented. I asked what she planned to do with her findings, whether she would publish them or share them with maritime authorities. She was quiet for a moment, then said she wasn't sure, that the implications were significant enough that she needed to be careful about how she proceeded. She said that if these vessels were part of classified government operations, then exposing their existence could have legal ramifications, could violate secrecy agreements or national security protocols that might still be in effect decades later. She said she'd seen researchers face consequences for publishing information that touched on classified programs, even when the information came from unclassified sources like Lighthouse logs, and she didn't want to end her career or face legal action over historical research. I understood her caution, But I also felt that the information deserved to be preserved, that future researchers should have access to what we'd found even if we couldn't immediately publish it. We decided to create a comprehensive documentation package, copies of all the relevant log entries, the incident reports, the correspondence, everything that related to the unverifiable vessels. Elowyn would keep one set of copies in her personal archives, I would keep another set at the Lighthouse, and we'd send a third set to a maritime history archive at a university where it would be preserved as part of the academic record, even if it wasn't immediately made public. The goal was to ensure that the information survived, that it couldn't be lost or destroyed if someone decided the Lighthouse logs contained material that was better left forgotten. We spent an entire day scanning documents, verifying that the digital files were complete and readable, packaging everything with detailed index notes that explained what we'd found and why it was significant. 2 weeks after Elowyn left the island, I received a visit from 2 men who identified themselves as representing the Department of Defense Historical Review Board. They said they'd been informed that the Lighthouse archives contained documents related to maritime operations during the Cold War era, and they needed to review those documents to ensure they didn't contain classified information that might still be subject to security restrictions. They were polite but insistent, and they had official credentials that appeared legitimate. I asked them how they'd learned about the documents, and they said it was routine, that the department periodically reviewed historical archives at federal facilities to identify material that might require reclassification or restricted access. I asked if I was required to provide them access, and they said that technically the Lighthouse was government property and the archives were federal records, so yes, they had authority to inspect the materials. I showed them to the archive room and watched as they spent 3 hours going through the logbooks, focusing specifically on the period from 1960 to 1965. They photographed several pages, made notes on a tablet, and asked questions about who had accessed the archives recently and what kind of research had been conducted. I told them about Elowyn's visit, described her work documenting navigation hazards, and mentioned that she'd found some interesting discrepancies in vessel records. They exchanged a glance, then asked if she'd taken copies of any documents. I said she'd scanned some materials for her research, standard practice for academic work, and they asked if I knew where those copies were stored. I said I didn't, that researchers were responsible for their own data management, and that the Lighthouse didn't track what happened to scanned documents after they left the station. After they left, I felt a growing unease about the visit, about the timing, about the specific focus on the exact period that contained the unverifiable vessel entries. I called Silas Quine and described the visit, and he was immediately concerned. He said the Historical Review Board was a legitimate entity, but that visits to Lighthouse archives were extremely rare, that most historical review work was conducted through formal requests to the National Archives rather than through direct inspection of remote station records. He said the timing, coming just 2 weeks after Elowyn had been at the station, suggested that someone was monitoring research activities, tracking who was accessing the archives and what they were finding. He asked if the men had removed any documents, and I said no, they'd only photographed pages, but I'd carefully noted which pages they'd photographed, and they included the Serpent's Cross incident report and the other entries describing unverifiable vessels. Silas said I should be careful, that if the Department of Defense was taking an interest in the archives, it suggested the material was more sensitive than we'd realized. He said he'd make some inquiries through his contacts, try to determine whether the visit was routine or whether it represented a more targeted effort to monitor or suppress information about Cold War maritime operations. He said I should secure copies of everything, make sure that the digital files were backed up in multiple locations, and consider whether the physical documents might be at risk of removal or destruction. I said I'd already made arrangements with Elowyn to preserve copies, and he said that was good, that distributing the information across multiple locations was the best way to ensure it survived. He also said, and his tone became very serious, that I should be prepared for the possibility that my research activities were now being monitored, that future visits might be less cordial, and that there could be pressure applied to discourage further investigation. I spent that evening going through the archive again, reviewing every document related to the Serpent's Cross and the other unverifiable vessels, trying to understand what about this information was sensitive enough to warrant Department of Defense attention 6 decades after the events occurred. The incident reports were detailed, but didn't contain any obvious classified information. No mention of weapons, no references to military operations, no indication that the vessels were engaged in anything beyond ordinary maritime activities. But perhaps that was the point, that the vessels were designed to appear ordinary, to blend in with commercial traffic, to conduct operations that would look innocuous to a casual observer, but that served purposes that remain classified. If the Serpent's Cross was carrying sensitive cargo, if its sinking resulted in the loss of material that the government didn't want to acknowledge, then the incident report would represent a security liability, evidence that something significant had happened that was supposed to remain secret. I contacted Elowin by email, using encrypted communication, and told her about the visit. She responded within hours, saying that she'd received a similar visit at her office. 2 different men, but with the same credentials and the same questions. She said they'd asked to see her research files, specifically any materials related to Pacific Coast Lighthouse archives, and she'd provided them with access to a selection of her data, carefully excluding the copies of the unverifiable vessel entries. She said the men had seemed satisfied, but had mentioned that certain historical maritime records were subject to ongoing security review, and that researchers who encountered potentially classified information were expected to report it to appropriate authorities rather than publishing it independently. She said the message was clear, that we'd stumbled onto something that powerful interests wanted to keep contained, and that continuing to investigate or publish could have consequences for both our careers and our personal security. I asked her if she was planning to abandon the research, and she said she didn't know, that she needed to weigh the value of exposing 60-year-old secrets against the risk of retaliation from agencies that still had the power to make life very difficult. She said she'd been thinking about the keepers who'd made those original log entries, men who'd documented what they observed because that was their job, who'd recorded vessel casualties and unusual activities because the protocols required it, and who probably never imagined that their careful record-keeping would become a security liability decades later. She said those keepers had done their duty, had maintained accurate records, and we owed it to them to ensure that their work wasn't erased, that the observations they'd made weren't buried and forgotten because they were inconvenient for institutional narratives. Over the following weeks, I became increasingly aware that my communications were likely being monitored, that the station's internet traffic was being analyzed, that my movements and activities were subject to surveillance that I couldn't detect but could feel. There were small indicators, subtle signs that someone was paying attention. Supply shipments arrived with minor discrepancies in the manifests. Coast Guard inspection visits became more frequent and more thorough, and I received several calls from National Park Service administrators asking detailed questions about the station's historical records and who had been granted access to them. I was careful in my responses, providing accurate information but volunteering nothing additional, maintaining professional courtesy while recognizing that every interaction was likely being documented and analyzed. I stopped conducting active research into the unverifiable vessels, stopped searching for additional information, stopped discussing the topic with colleagues or visitors, but I maintained my private archive, continued updating my documentation, continued preserving every scrap of information I could find about the vessels that existed in Lighthouse logs, but nowhere else. I cataloged the documents meticulously, cross-referenced entries, built a timeline that showed the pattern of unregistered maritime activity along the Pacific coast during the Cold War era. The archive grew slowly but steadily, a shadow history existing in parallel to the official records, documenting events that were supposed to have been forgotten, vessels that were supposed to have left no trace. 3 months after the Historical Review Board visit, Silas called with an update. He said he'd been making discreet inquiries through retired Coast Guard personnel, asking about maritime operations in the early 60s, whether there had been classified programs that might explain the unverifiable vessel entries. He said one former officer, now in his 80s, had told him off the record that there had been a joint military intelligence operation during that period, involving the use of civilian vessels for surveillance and cargo transport. Operations that were conducted with minimal documentation to maintain plausible deniability. The officer said the program had used container ships, fishing trawlers, and private yachts that had been retrofitted with specialized equipment, that the vessels operated under false identities and followed routes designed to avoid standard monitoring systems. He said the Serpent's Cross sinking had been a significant loss, that the vessel had been carrying equipment that couldn't be recovered from the depth where it went down, and that the incident had led to changes in operational protocols to reduce the risk of similar losses. Silas said the officer had been reluctant to provide details, had emphasized that much of the information remained classified, and had suggested that further investigation would be unwise. But he'd confirmed that the Lighthouse logs were accurate, that the vessels documented by the keepers had been real, and that their absence from official records was deliberate, part of security measures designed to protect sensitive operations. Silas said he'd compiled a brief report on his findings, but he was keeping it private, sharing it only with a few trusted colleagues because publishing it would likely trigger legal action or security reviews that could shut down his career. He said he thought I should make the same decision, that the information was important, but that the personal cost of making it public might be too high, especially given that the operations were decades old and most of the people involved were dead or retired. I've thought about Silas's advice constantly over the past few months, weighed the obligation to preserve historical truth against the practical realities of institutional power and security protocols. I've continued maintaining the Lighthouse, performing my duties, documenting maritime traffic, and keeping the light burning. But I've also continued maintaining my private archive, preserving the evidence that certain vessels passed through these waters but were never supposed to be remembered, that maritime operations occurred that left no official trace, and that the only record of those events exists in the careful observations of lighthouse keepers who documented what they saw regardless of whether anyone wanted it documented. The Serpent's Cross lies somewhere on the ocean floor 8 miles northwest of this station, in water too deep for casual salvage, carrying cargo that was never declared, and crew members whose names don't appear on any memorial. The incident report remains in the Lighthouse archive, a detailed account of a sinking that officially never happened, of a vessel that officially never existed, preserved because one keeper believed that his job was to record the truth even when the truth was inconvenient. I think about William Graves, the keeper who wrote that report, who watched a ship go down and documented every detail, who fulfilled his responsibility to maintain accurate records even though he probably sensed that the vessel he was observing wasn't what it appeared to be. I think about the other keepers up and down the coast who made similar entries, who noted vessels that didn't quite fit the patterns, who documented anomalies and irregularities because that's what the job required. And I think about the vessels themselves, the ships that moved through these waters carrying secrets, operating under false identities, leaving no trace except in the logs of isolated lighthouse stations where keepers watched the sea and recorded what they saw. The official maritime history of the Pacific coast doesn't include the Serpent's Cross, doesn't acknowledge the classified operations, doesn't admit that there were vessels deliberately operating outside the documentation systems that we rely on to understand maritime activity. But the truth exists in the Lighthouse logs, preserved in handwritten entries, waiting for a time when security restrictions expire, and historians can finally incorporate these shadow vessels into the complete narrative of our maritime past. Until then, I keep the light, maintain the archive, and preserve the evidence that some ships were meant to be forgotten but deserve to be remembered. My name is Ephraim Gulliver, and I've been keeping the Hesita headlight for 16 years. The lighthouse stands on a headland 205 feet above the Pacific, 12 miles north of Florence, Oregon, with a first-order Fresnel lens visible for 21 nautical miles. The waters here are treacherous, rocky shoals, and unpredictable currents where dense fog can persist for days when warm inland air meets cold ocean water. The fog signal is critical equipment, a powerful pneumatic horn that sounds 2 blasts every 30 seconds when visibility drops below a quarter mile. Eulalie Northcote serves as the station's fog signal engineer, responsible for the compressor systems, air reservoirs, and electronic timing mechanisms. She's been working lighthouses for 18 years, transferred here from Cape Disappointment with expertise in the most sophisticated fog signal equipment on the West Coast. What happened last September began during routine maintenance on the fog signal system. Eulalie had been conducting quarterly inspections when she discovered an anomaly in the digital timing logs. The computerized record that documents every activation, timestamps each blast, and tracks operating hours for maintenance scheduling. The logs showed activations during a 3-hour period on August 22nd, a night when weather had been clear with visibility exceeding 10 miles, conditions under which the fog signal should never have been activated. She verified visibility had been excellent and checked manual control logs for any testing. There was no record of manual activation, no maintenance entry, nothing that would explain why the signal had run for 3 hours broadcasting into clear air. She brought the discrepancy to my attention, and we reviewed the data together. The activation pattern was precise, exactly matching standard fog signal timing, running continuously from 2317 hours until 0217 hours. I checked my log entries for that night and confirmed I'd been on watch conducting routine observations, documenting clear conditions with no fog, no reduced visibility, no reason to activate the signal. I remembered the night clearly because it had been unusually calm and clear, stars visible to the horizon. I hadn't heard the fog signal, hadn't received alerts from the automated monitoring system, hadn't observed anything unusual. Yet, according to the digital logs, the signal had been running for 3 hours while I was on watch. Eulalie suggested the logging system might be malfunctioning, recording ghost activations due to electrical interference or software glitches. We ran diagnostics checking sensors, data protocols, timestamp accuracy. Everything tested normal, full functionality, no errors. She said she'd seen occasional false entries before, single records caused by power surges, but never a 3-hour sequence with perfect consistency and proper formatting. If the log was inaccurate, there should be corrupted data, missing timestamps, irregular patterns. But the log showed perfectly normal fog signal activation, indistinguishable from legitimate operations, except it occurred during clear weather and apparently produced no sound anyone could hear. I contacted Peregrine Ainslow, the SAR coordinator at the Coast Guard station in Newport, and described the anomaly. He checked their records and called back with information that deepened the mystery. The Coast Guard had received a radio transmission on August 22nd at approximately 2330 hours. A vessel reporting it was using the Hesita head fog signal for navigation, following the sound to maintain position offshore. The transmission was brief, routine, from a fishing vessel identifying itself as the Meridian's Wake, giving a position approximately 4 nautical miles west of the lighthouse. But when he checked weather data, he found excellent visibility, no fog, no reason for a vessel to navigate by sound rather than visual reference. He tried to follow up with the Meridian's wake, checking vessel registries, harbor masters, fishing associations. No vessel with that name was registered anywhere. The vessel that reported using our fog signal didn't exist in any official database. The convergence was unsettling. A fog signal activation no one heard during clear weather, and a vessel reporting use of that signal despite excellent visibility, and that vessel having no official existence. Eulalie and I checked every system looking for explanations. We verified sound projectors were functioning correctly, checked for recording equipment, reviewed vessel traffic data from the automated identification system. Nothing, no AIS signals, no radar returns, no indication any vessel was present. I pulled historical records searching for similar incidents and found 2 comparable entries, one from 2011 and one from 2007, both describing unexplained fog signal activations during good visibility, both noted in logs but never explained. The pattern suggested this had been occurring periodically for years. I decided to conduct night watches specifically monitoring the fog signal system. I positioned myself in the tower with clear line of sight to the fog signal building, set up audio recording equipment, and maintained detailed logs with synchronized timestamps. After 5 consecutive nights with nothing unusual, on the 6th night, September 17th at 01:43 hours, I saw the fog signal building's indicator lights activate. Bright red indicators flashing in sync with the timing pattern. 2 flashes every 30 seconds. I grabbed binoculars, confirmed the lights were active, positioned the audio recorder outside, and waited for the sound. No sound came. The indicators were flashing, showing the system believed it was operating. But there was no audible blast, no deep resonant horn that should have been impossible to miss. I radioed Eulalie, who confirmed she could see the indicator lights and couldn't hear any sound. She checked the control panel and it showed normal operation, proper air pressure, correct timing sequence, all parameters indicating the fog signal was broadcasting. But there was no sound, just silent flashing lights and vibration in the airline suggesting compressed air was moving through the system without producing acoustic output. The activation continued for 90 minutes, indicators flashing, control panel showing normal operation, digital log recording every cycle, producing no audible signal. At 03:13 hours, the lights went out, the system shut down, and the log recorded deactivation. We conducted immediate inspection checking horn mechanisms, resonator chambers, acoustic projectors. Everything was in place, properly aligned, no signs of obstruction or malfunction. She activated the system manually and it functioned perfectly, producing the expected powerful blast. Whatever caused the silent activation had resolved itself, leaving no physical evidence. 2 weeks later, Peregrine called. The Coast Guard had received another transmission during September 17th at approximately 01:45 hours from the Meridian's wake reporting use of the Hesita head fog signal for navigation. The timing matched exactly with the silent activation I'd observed. He'd tried again to locate the vessel through every maritime database and found nothing. The Meridian's wake didn't exist in any official record. He said that in SAR work, occasionally there are cases that don't fit rational explanation, where something impossible appears to happen and disappears without leaving verifiable evidence. The Meridian's wake was becoming one of those cases, a vessel existing only in radio transmissions, using a fog signal that operates only in digital logs. Eulalie and I documented everything obsessively, maintaining detailed logs, recording audio continuously, photographing equipment after every activation. The silent activations continued, occurring approximately once every 3 weeks, always at night during clear visibility, always lasting 90 minutes to 3 hours. Each time the indicator lights showed operation, control panel displayed normal parameters, digital logs recorded every cycle, but no sound was produced. And each time, within minutes of activation starting, the Coast Guard would receive a transmission from the Meridian's wake. The consistency was impossible to dismiss as coincidence, the timing too precise, the pattern too regular. Eulalie spent weeks examining the fog signal system, dismantling components, checking wiring, analyzing control software. She found no mechanical or electrical fault, no evidence of tampering. Then she discovered something significant. The fog signal control system was accessible through an outdated remote management interface installed years ago to allow technicians to monitor equipment without visiting physically. The interface was supposed to be secured, but she found the security protocols were obsolete, vulnerable to modern hacking. Someone with the right tools could potentially access the system remotely, trigger activations, modify logging data, all without leaving obvious traces. The discovery was troubling because it meant our systems had been compromised for an unknown period, but useful because it provided a mechanism explaining how the phantom activations were occurring. We reported the vulnerability to the Coast Guard and equipment manufacturer, requesting immediate security updates. Within 2 weeks, technicians arrived to upgrade control systems, install new security measures, eliminate remote access vulnerabilities. They installed monitoring equipment to track any access attempts, record the source of commands, create detailed audit trails. The silent activations stopped after the security upgrades were implemented. The pattern that had been occurring regularly for months suddenly ceased, and the Meridian's wake made no further transmissions. When we secured the systems and eliminated the vulnerability, the phantom operations stopped because they were no longer possible. Peregrine said the Coast Guard was treating it as confirmed system compromise, likely related to smuggling operations, though they had no specific suspects. He said investigations were ongoing, examining similar incidents at other stations, looking for patterns. He said I should be prepared for the possibility that our documentation might be crucial for future prosecution. I said I would cooperate fully, that the integrity of Lighthouse systems was too important to allow criminal exploitation to go unpunished. It's been 4 months since the security upgrades, and there have been no further silent activations, no transmissions from the Meridian's wake, no unexplained anomalies. The equipment operates normally, activating when fog rolls in, remaining silent during clear weather, functioning as designed. But I listen more carefully now, paying attention to subtle sounds of the station, alert for anything suggesting another compromise. The knowledge that someone accessed our equipment, used our fog signal to create cover for illegal operations, manipulated our logs to create false records. It's changed how I think about this work, about the assumption that Lighthouse systems are secure and trustworthy. I keep wondering about the Meridian's wake, whether it was entirely fictional or whether there was a real vessel using that name as call sign while conducting operations that couldn't withstand scrutiny. I wonder if phantom transmissions served their purpose, if actual vessels moved through these waters while patrol boats searched for a ship that didn't exist, if cargo was landed on remote beaches while authorities chased radio signals from empty coordinates. I wonder how many Lighthouse stations have experienced similar compromises. How many phantom vessels exist in radio logs making transmissions that create confusion and cover for criminal activity? The historical record suggests this has been happening for years, perhaps decades, with different keepers documenting unexplained activations without understanding what they were observing. The fog signal stands ready, maintained, and secure, protected by modern security measures that should prevent unauthorized access. The Fresnel lens rotates with its ancient precision. The light sweeps across the sea. warning vessels away from rocky shoals. And I continue my watch, keeping the light, maintaining the equipment, documenting what I observe with the understanding that not everything in the logs represents what it appears to be, that maritime documentation can be manipulated, that vessels can exist in records without existing in the water. The Meridian's wake is gone from the radio frequencies, silent now, perhaps moved to other waters where lighthouse systems are less secure, perhaps discontinued because risk of discovery became too high. But I doubt it's truly gone, doubt that the sophisticated operation behind it has simply ceased. More likely it's adapted, found new methods, new vulnerabilities to exploit, new ways to create phantom signals and false records that allow real vessels to move unseen through waters that are supposed to be monitored and secure. Somewhere, at some lighthouse, a keeper is probably experiencing unexplained anomalies right now, documenting them carefully, trying to understand what they mean, not yet aware that what they're observing is evidence of ongoing criminal operation that depends on their confusion, that thrives in the gaps between what equipment shows and what actually occurs. I think about all the silent activations that occurred before we discovered the vulnerability, all the times the Meridian's wake made its phantom transmissions, all the nights when real vessels were moving through these waters using the confusion as cover. The logs show only what we could document, the surface pattern of anomalies and impossibilities, but beneath that surface is a darker truth about vessels that deliberately erase their own existence. Operations that depend on corrupting the very systems meant to keep mariners safe. And the keepers who stand watch never quite certain whether what they're observing is real or phantom, whether the vessels in their logs exist in the water, or only in the carefully manipulated records of systems that were supposed to be trustworthy but turned out to be as vulnerable as everything else that touches the sea.